Russians have been stockpiling the same 20 foods for centuries, and most of them cost almost nothing. All of them are still in Russian pantries today. Some literally never expire. These are foods that kept families alive through famines, the siege of Leningrad, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the world panics, Russians don't. Today, we're counting down 20 of them, from number 20 down to number 1. By number 7, you'll understand why Russian sailors didn't die of scurvy. Number 3 is what every Russian buys the moment a crisis breaks out, and the shelves empty within hours. And number 1, it's been found in Egyptian tombs after 3,000 years, still perfectly edible. Grab a pen. Let's begin. 20. Dried bread rings. Sushki. Sushki are tiny, hard, glossy rings of bread, often threaded onto a long cord like an edible necklace and logged in Russian pantries. They look like jewelry, but they were originally survival food, carried by merchants traveling the long road from Moscow to Siberia for weeks at a time. The dough is simple. Wheat flour, water, yeast, and salt are mixed to form small rings, briefly boiled like bagels for that signature glassy shine, then baked slowly at a low temperature until every drop of water is gone. With no water content, sushki cannot grow mold or harbor bacteria. Stored in a paper bag or tin in a dry pantry, they keep for many months without going stale. Dunk them in hot black tea for 10 seconds before eating so they soften just enough to be chewy without going soggy. Number 19 is so old the Tsars requested it by name. 19. Russian fruit confection, pastila. Pastila is one of the oldest sweets in Russian history. It's been made in Russian monasteries as far back as the 14th century, and by the 1800s, Catherine the Great was serving it to foreign dignitaries. The town of Kolomna, outside Moscow, still makes it today using 16th century recipes. Hard Antonovka apples are baked until soft, pushed through a sieve, then beaten for hours with sugar and egg white into a pale, airy mousse. The mousse is spread thin onto wooden trays and dried slowly in a low oven, sometimes overnight, until it holds its shape but melts on the tongue. This leaves no water, high sugar, and no fat to go rancid. Packed in tin boxes, pastila stays fresh for several months. Wait 2 days after baking before eating because the texture transforms, becoming denser, sweeter, and more complex than day 1. Number 18 will set your mouth on fire. 18. Caucasian spice paste, adjika. Where Western cuisines have hot sauce, Russians have adjika, a thick, garlicky herbal paste so fiery it can make you sweat in a Siberian winter. It came north from the Caucasus Mountains, carried by Abkhazian and Georgian shepherds. By the Soviet era, every Russian household had a jar. Red chili peppers, garlic, salt, walnuts, and dried herbs like blue fenugreek and coriander are pounded into a thick paste on a stone slab. Many Russian versions also stir in cooked tomatoes for a milder, ruby-red variation. The combination of high salt, natural antimicrobial compounds in the garlic and chili, and a top layer of oil that blocks all air ensures properly made adjika keeps for a year or more in a cool pantry with no refrigeration needed. Stir a spoonful into ground meat before frying to transform cheap minced meat into something tasting like it was marinated for days. In Siberia, they call the next one the throat ripper. 17. Horseradish tomato relish, krenovina. In Siberia, they call it gorloder, literally the throat ripper. Krenovina combines ripe summer tomatoes, raw garlic, and freshly grated horseradish root into one of the sharpest condiments on earth. 1 spoonful can clear your sinuses from across the room. The process is entirely uncooked. Ripe tomatoes are blended raw with garlic and freshly dug horseradish root before salt and sometimes sugar are added. Everything goes straight into sterilized jars and gets sealed with no heat treatment. Garlic contains allicin and horseradish contains powerful isothiocyanates, which are both strong antimicrobials. Combined with salt and tomato acidity, they prevent spoilage even at cool room temperatures. Refrigerated, krenovina keeps for 6 months or longer. Make it in late summer when tomatoes are at their peak and make a triple batch, as it improves in the jar for the first 3 weeks before stabilizing. 16. Rendered pork lard, smallets. Most cuisines throw lard out, but Russians turned it into a cooking foundation. Smallets, rendered pork fat clarified into a smooth white spread. was once so valuable that families passed it down like silverware. Long before vegetable oils were affordable, this was the primary cooking fat across Russia and Ukraine. Cubes of pork fat from the back or belly are slowly heated for hours. As the fat melts, small bits of meat brown into crackling called shkvarki. The clear fat is strained through cheesecloth and poured into ceramic crocks, sometimes with garlic, onion, or apple added for extra antimicrobial power. Rendering removes all water and proteins, which are the two things bacteria need. Sealed and kept cool, Smolets keeps for many months at room temperature. Use it instead of butter for frying onions, as the flavor base it creates is what makes traditional borscht taste different from any restaurant version. Number Biscuit 15 grows in Russian forests and is treated like buried gold. 15. Dried wild mushrooms. Sushony gribi. Russia is one of the great mushroom foraging countries on Earth. Mushroom picking has its own season, late summer through the first frost, and entire families head into the birch and pine forests with baskets, returning with porcini, chanterelles, milk caps, and aspen boletes. What can't be eaten or pickled is dried. The harvest is cleaned without water, sliced thick, and threaded onto strings or laid out on wooden trays. The strings hang above the Russian pesh, a tile-faced masonry stove that radiates gentle heat, or in summer attics. Over a day or two, the mushrooms lose nearly all moisture. With the water gone, mold and bacteria have nothing to feed on. Stored in glass jars in a dry pantry, dried mushrooms keep for 2 to 3 years. Save the soaking water when you rehydrate them, because that is pure mushroom stock that you should never throw out. We're a third of the way through. Coming up at number 8, the food every Russian household has in a jar right now. And at number 1, the only food on Earth that quite literally cannot expire. Stay with me. Now, number 14. 14. Soaked apples. Mochione yabloki. This one will sound strange. Before refrigeration reached Russian villages, peasants discovered that whole apples submerged in barrels of salted, sweetened water could last from autumn through the following spring. They called them mochione yabloki, soaked apples, and they appeared on both peasant tables and czarist banquets. The only acceptable apple is the Antonovka, hard, acidic, and intensely fragrant. The apples are packed whole into wooden barrels lined with rye straw, blackcurrant leaves, and cherry leaves. A mixture of water, salt, sugar, and sometimes rye flour is poured over them. Within weeks, fermentation takes hold and sugars convert to lactic acid. The flesh stays firm and slightly fizzy, and a proper barrel keeps apples crisp from October through April. Eat them at room temperature rather than cold, as the slight effervescence and depth of flavor are muted when chilled. Number 13 comes from Pacific salmon, and only the wealthy could afford it in Tsarist Russia. 13. Salt-cured salmon roe, krasnaya ikra. This is the most expensive food on this list. Krasnaya ikra, salted red caviar, is harvested from Pacific salmon along the rivers of Kamchatka and Sakhalin, where indigenous peoples have been preserving it for thousands of years. In the 20th century, it became a national symbol on every Russian holiday table. Fresh roe is freed from its membrane through a fine mesh, then immersed in a strong salt brine for several minutes. Salt levels are calibrated carefully to ensure there is enough to preserve the eggs without overpowering their flavor. The roe is drained, brushed with oil, and packed into sterilized jars. The salt draws out moisture and blocks microbial growth, allowing sealed jars to keep in a cold pantry for many months. Serve it on toasted black bread with cold butter, which creates a barrier that lets the caviar hit your tongue at full strength. Number 12 has been simmering on Russian dacha stoves for centuries. 12. Whole fruit preserves, varen. At the end of every Russian summer, a copper basin bubbles on the stove of every dacha across the country. Inside, strawberries, raspberries, sour cherries, or apricots simmer in syrup. This is vareni, different from Western jam in one critical way. The fruit is kept whole, intact, and suspended in its own thick syrup. Fresh fruit is gently layered with sugar and left to release its juice. The mixture is cooked slowly in small batches and sometimes rested overnight to keep the fruit whole rather than mashing it to pulp. Once thickened, it's ladled hot into sterilized jars and sealed. The sugar content is often equal parts fruit and sugar, which creates an environment where microbes cannot survive. Sealed jars keep in a cool pantry for 2 to 3 years. Spoon it into hot black tea instead of adding sugar, as that is how Russian grandmothers have been drinking tea for centuries. Number 11 was on every single Soviet New Year's table from Leningrad to Vladivostok. 11. Smoked sprats in oil, shproti. If you ever celebrated New Year's Eve in the Soviet Union, you saw these on every single table. Shproti are tiny smoked fish, Baltic sprats or small herring, packed into flat tin cans and sealed in golden oil. Production took off in the 1950s in factories around Riga, and these little tins became so embedded in Soviet culture that no holiday felt complete without them. The fish are cleaned, brined in salt water, hot smoked over alder or beech, arranged in tin cans, covered in oil, hermetically sealed and sterilized under pressure. Smoke deposits antimicrobial compounds, oil seals out air, and metal blocks light. Together, these elements allow shproti to remain edible for 5 years or more. Open the can, drain off most of the oil, and serve cold on black rye bread rubbed with raw garlic to enjoy the classic Russian zakuska. Halfway through. 20 foods. Real Russian history. Coming up at number 3. The food Russians buy first when a crisis breaks out. At number 1, a food so stable it survives millennia. Stay with me. Top 10 now. 10. Dry cured smoked sausage, syrokopchionaya kolbasa. This sausage has never been cooked, never boiled, and never touched heat. Instead, it hangs in a cold smokehouse for 1 to 3 months, salted, smoked, and dried until it can sit at room temperature for nearly a year without spoiling. Russians have been making syrokopchionaya kolbasa for centuries. Lean meat and back fat are coarsely chopped with salt, garlic, black pepper, and sometimes cognac, then stuffed into natural casings. The sausages are briefly air-dried, cold smoked over fruit wood for several days, then hung in cool ventilated rooms for weeks. With most water gone and salt levels high, bacteria cannot survive. Sliced thin, it reveals a deep ruby color flecked with white fat. Slice it on the bias and paper thin, because the fat catches the light and the texture transforms. Sliced thick, it's chewy, but paper thin, it dissolves. Number 9 has been preserved the exact same way for over 800 years. 9. Sun-dried saltfish, vobla. This one shocks people the first time they see it. Vobla is what happens when the Caspian Sea meets 800 years of salt and patience. A small relative of the carp, caught by the millions every spring in the Volga Delta, preserved the same way Russian fishermen have since the Middle Ages. Fresh vobla is barely gutted, packed into thick layers of coarse salt for several days, while the salt draws nearly all moisture from the flesh. The fish is then rinsed, threaded through the eyes onto a string, and hung outdoors in the dry spring wind for 1 to 3 weeks. With moisture gone and salt high, vobla is completely inhospitable to bacteria. Stored cool and dry, it keeps for many months without refrigeration. Tear it apart with your hands rather than a knife, as pulling along the grain releases the fish in clean, salty strips that hold their shape and flavor. Number 8 is what every Russian household has in a jar right now. 8. Salt-brined cucumbers, solyonye ogurtsi. The pickled cucumber may be the most photographed food in Russian culture. Long, knobby, deep green, floating in cloudy brine with dill and garlic. Solyonye ogurtsi appear at every celebration and every vodka toast. The tradition goes back 500 years, and Suzdal is still the country's pickle capital. What makes Russian pickles different is their brine fermented, not vinegar pickled. Small fresh cucumbers are packed into jars or oak barrels with dill flowers, garlic, horseradish leaves, black currant leaves, and bay leaf. A cold salt brine of about 5% salinity is poured over them. Wild lactic acid bacteria take over, producing acid that prevents spoilage. Sealed in a cool cellar, jars keep for a year or more. Drink the brine afterward, as Russians have used pickle brine as a hangover cure for centuries to rehydrate with electrolytes faster than sports drinks. Number 7 saved Russian sailors from scurvy. Exactly what I promised you at the start. 7. Fermented cabbage, kvashenaya kapusta. Here's the answer to scurvy. When autumn ends in Russia, villages from Tver to Tomsk gather to shred, salt, and pack cabbage into giant wooden barrels. This is kvashenaya kapusta, fermented cabbage, and for centuries it stood between Russian families and the bitter dark of winter. White cabbage is shredded thin, mixed with coarse salt, sometimes layered with grated carrots, cranberries, or apples, then packed tightly and weighted with a heavy stone. Within days, lactic acid bacteria begin fermenting the sugars. The acid kills harmful microbes, salt prevents spoilage, and fermentation preserves vitamin C through the whole winter. While European sailors died of scurvy on long voyages, Russians who ate kvashenaya kapusta all winter stayed alive. Kept cool, it lasts 6 to 8 months. Eat it raw and never cooked, as heat destroys the vitamin C within minutes. Serving it cold with sunflower oil and onion is the traditional way. Number 6 kept over 1 million people alive during the worst siege of the 20th century. 6. Twice-baked bread, scurvy. When the Nazis surrounded Leningrad in 1941, the 900-day siege that followed killed over 1 million civilians. The people who stretched their survival longest had one thing in common: scurvy. Scurvy are the ghost of bread, dried, hardened, and stripped of all moisture. Slices of rye or wheat bread are placed in a low oven for several hours until every drop of water is driven out. Without moisture, mold and bacteria cannot grow. Stored in linen bags or tin boxes in a dry corner of the pantry, scurvy last for many months, often years. They have no expiration date because there is nothing inside them that can expire. Dunk them in hot tea, milk, or broth for 10 to 15 seconds so they soften without disintegrating, which is the same technique that kept besieged civilians eating when their teeth started failing from malnutrition. Number 5 is what every Russian over 40 calls the taste of childhood. 5. Sweetened condensed milk, sgushchenka. Ask any Russian over 40 about sgushchenka and watch their face change. It is pure Soviet nostalgia in a tin. Thick, sweet, golden condensed milk in the iconic blue and white can. Invented in 1881, sgushchenka became one of the most beloved foods in Soviet history, and Soviet cosmonauts even carried it into space. Fresh whole milk is slowly heated with sugar, evaporating most of the water until the mixture thickens into a pale gold syrup. The sugar concentration reaches around 44%, which is high enough that bacteria cannot survive. The hot liquid is poured into sterilized cans, sealed, and heat processed. Low water, high sugar, and an airtight metal seal make sgushchenka almost indestructible, allowing unopened tins to last 5 to 7 years at room temperature. Boil the unopened tin in water for 2 hours to transform the contents into varenka, a thick caramel beloved by every Russian child. Number 4 won the Second World War for the Soviet Union. Exactly what I promised you. 4. Canned stewed meat, tushionka. In 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army was starving. The American Lend-Lease program shipped millions of cans of stewed meat, which Russian soldiers called the Second Front while still waiting for the real one. By the time they reached Berlin, tushionka had become a legend. Tushionka is beef, pork, or lamb, slow-cooked in its own fat with salt, bay leaf, and pepper, then sealed in a metal can. Fatty cuts are packed raw into sterilized tins and slow-cooked inside the sealed can in a high-pressure autoclave. The heat tenderizes the meat and kills every microbe, and as the can cools, the fat solidifies on top to seal the contents from oxygen. A well-made can sits on a shelf for 7 to 10 years and still tastes rich when opened. Stir it into hot kasha or potatoes and never eat it cold, as the flavor base it creates is what soldiers, hunters, and fishermen have relied on for over 100 years. Top 3. The foods every Russian family knows by heart. Pay attention. 3. Buckwheat, grechka. Here it is. The food I told you to grab a pen for. When Russians sense a crisis, economic collapse, political instability, war, the very first thing they buy is grechka. Grocery shelves empty within hours, every single time. Despite the name, buckwheat is not wheat at all. It's a small triangular seed brought from the Far East over 1,000 years ago and cultivated by Byzantine monks, which is how it became Greek grain in Russia. By the Soviet era, It was the unofficial national grain that soldiers, school children, and cosmonauts all ate. The seeds are hulled and lightly roasted until warm brown. Because the kernel is dense and protected by a tough outer husk, dry Grechka keeps in a cupboard for 15 years without losing flavor or nutrition. Toast it in a dry pan for 2 minutes before adding water to double the nutty flavor, which is the technique every Russian grandmother uses but never explains. Number 2 is so beloved that Russian and Ukrainian families have been known to fight over the last slice. 2. Cured pork fat, salo. I know what you're thinking, pork fat, but stay with me. To outsiders, salo looks strange. A thick slab of pure white pork fat streaked with garlic and pepper, sliced paper-thin and eaten cold. To Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, it is a national treasure, a battlefield ration, and a survival food over 1,000 years old. Slabs of fatback are rubbed with coarse salt, garlic, and bay leaf, then layered into wooden boxes or linen cloth and left cold for days or weeks. The salt draws out moisture while the dense fat blocks bacterial growth, and some versions are cold smoked over fruit wood. Stored cold, salo keeps for many months at room temperature, and for years when frozen. It delivers nearly 9,000 calories per kilogram as pure winter fuel. Always slice it cold straight from the freezer if needed, as warm salo tears. The colder the knife, the thinner the slice, and the better the bite. And now, number 1. The food that quite literally never expires. 1. Bashkir honey, Bashkirsky miod. Sealed pots of honey have been found in Egyptian tombs after 3,000 years, still perfectly edible. And in Russia, no honey is more revered than Bashkir honey, harvested from the southern Ural Mountains where the Bashkir people have practiced wild honey gathering for over 1,500 years. The bees forage on linden, sweet clover, and wild mountain herbs. Some hives are still kept in hollowed tree trunks deep in the forest, a tradition called Bortnichestvo dating to the Middle Ages. Beekeepers harvest the combs in late summer, strain the honey through cloth, and pour it into clay pots or glass jars with no additives and no pasteurization. Low water content, high sugar concentration, mild acidity, and trace hydrogen peroxide from natural enzymes make it literally incapable of going bad. If your honey crystallizes, don't throw it out. Warm the jar in hot water for 10 minutes to return it to liquid form, completely unchanged. And that is 20. 20 foods that outlasted famines, sieges, revolutions, and the fall of an empire. Born not from fashion, but from centuries of hard winters and harder history. But Russia isn't the only country with secrets like these. Every great food culture has its own version of this list, its own cellars, its own 1,000-year-old methods, its own foods built to outlast time. The next pantry is already waiting here on the channel. We'll see you in the next one.